at the core of that is this debate: is it individual change versus system change? And on where the work I've been doing, it's like, well, it's a bit of both. Um, and the individual really has an important role to play. And eventually, and ultimately, what I'm trying to get, the point I'm trying to make in the book is there's no such thing as the individual, and that as a basis for action on climate change is a failure and will continue to fail.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining me, Chris. Today I'm joined by Christopher Shaw. Chris has over 15 years of experience researching climate policy and climate communications and is the head of research at Climate Outreach. Chris is a contributing author for the IPCC Working Group 1 Sixth Assessment Report, is the non-executive director of the award-winning environmental news organisation DeSmog, and is an associate at the Tyndall Centre of Climate Change Research and a research associate in the School of Global Studies at the University of Sussex. And today, Chris, will be discussing your book that you recently wrote called Liberalism and the Challenge of Climate Change, which I'm very excited to jump into. But thank you for joining me, Chris.
Thanks, Javier. Really looking forward to this chat today.
I'd love to hear the story behind the book, behind climate change and liberalism, how you came to write about it, and what was the inception of the book.
Thanks, Javier. It's a long story. I'll be as brief as I can. Where does one start? There's two elements to that. There's my interrelated elements. I think there's the anxiety about climate change, which is rooted back in my teenage years. So there's that, and then related to that is the political system that seems to be marching us towards this awful outcome. And actually, for the vast majority of humanity, what they get in return for this risk or this almost inevitable outcome seems very little. And so that sort of sense of injustice and being lied to is kind of what has motivated me for a long time. And really, I grew up in the late 70s, early 1980s, and that time saw the advent of, in the UK, Margaret Thatcher, but more broadly in the US, Ronald Reagan, the birth of something that's been called neoliberalism. And I felt as I came into adulthood at that time, it was creating a world where all that mattered was money, achievement, status, and the individual, the entrepreneurial individual, out for everything they could get for themselves and nothing else mattered, trampling on other people, trampling on the world to get that. So I entered adulthood, entered a world that I didn't feel at home in, felt very alienated from this world that was being presented to me and the options that were being presented to me, the markers of success and a life well lived. But remember, in the early 80s, anything of discussion of living sustainably, living in harmony with the world, living in harmony with each other, was just hippie nonsense. There was no room for it. So I was carrying that anxiety and a person out of place, a stranger in a strange land, for a long time. And then climate change emerged onto the agenda, 1989, 1990. So at this stage, I was a rebel looking for a cause, and climate change was that cause. I immediately felt, okay, this is huge. It just made sense. I could see the gung-ho attitude, the irreverent attitude to the natural world, the dismissive attitude to the natural world, this high-risk strategy of just get everything you can, to hell with the consequences. Climate change seemed to me to be the epitome of where this would take us. It just seemed inevitable in 1989, 1990, this is going to be a huge crisis. It just made so much sense. I could see it. So I kind of hitched, myself to that wagon, but there wasn't really a wagon there. There was nothing, no one was talking about it. If I spoke about it to people, they didn't know what I was talking about. They didn't really understand. There was no work. There was no options. So for the next few years was a search for a way to do something about this issue. And eventually, so that involved going back to university to do a teacher training course to teach about climate change to young people. Thought that might be the way to contribute to a better future. And then I moved into marketing, and so I could learn how to communicate messages to mass audiences about climate change. And so spent some time doing that, and then one reason or another went back into academia, did a PhD, and have worked in research for various organisations, universities, and most recently in this NGO. But the other thing that happened during that time to reinforce my concern and my anxiety was liberalism appearing to be, and at this point I was really, up to about 2000, I was really on board with liberalism. It was, I felt, in not neoliberalism, but liberalism, I felt very identified with, that the ideas of progressiveness, reason, rationality, etc. And then what happened? What happened was, and this may feel like a bit of a tangent, but it's not, 9/11, 2001. I read at the time Herman and Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent. So I was reading that, and around about that time, and I was thinking, oh, right, so the media isn't, that position isn't actually what good and reasonable people should adhere to necessarily. There's something going on here. And then 9/11, 2001 happened. And when I woke up the next day, I thought, okay, the West would be contrite, saying, yeah, the things would be, the way that the West has been interfering in other countries in the world has blown back, and we need to reconsider and be more humble with the West, and work. But no, when I woke up the next day, the headlines were, this is war. The response was aggression. It was intensification of this imperialistic, violent attitude, patriarchal attitude to the world and to others. And then the Iraq War happened, and you had all the lies about weapons of mass destruction. So something really happened there. And then that was in 2003. And in 2003, there's a European heat wave. And that was celebrated in the media as wonderful, some decent weather at long last in the UK. This is wonderful. So the combination of the media not being able to understand what that European heatwave of 2003 meant, which at the time was the biggest natural disaster ever to hit Europe, and yet the media was celebrating it, certainly in the UK, and the Iraq War in 2003, that was like the trigger. And then from then on, I just, and so it was like, if you're with a lover who's being unfaithful, but you love them still, and you keep going back to them, they still keep being unfaithful. They still keep kicking you in the teeth. They still keep hurting you. You still keep going back for more and more. That was like me and liberalism, right? And then when I realized that was not there for me, they was not looking out for me, there was nowhere to turn. What I thought was my ally was no longer my ally. That is really the genesis of the book. That is really the genesis of my journey to critique the liberal constructions of climate change. So my PhD was about how did 2 degrees, which was being marked as the scientists tell us we mustn't go above 2 degrees warming to avoid dangerous climate change. How did that get established? How does that idea get reproduced in the media? It was clear to me 2 degrees was a very high risk strategy. When you looked at the science, it was disaster. And eventually, I guess science caught up and thought, oh no, we better go for 1.5 degrees. Well, 66% chance, 1.5 degrees. So my PhD was about how the idea of 2 degrees centigrade as a dangerous limit is manufactured and reproduced and legitimized in the mainstream discourse. And this book is kind of an extension of those ideas. It's drilling down a bit further into actually, so it moves beyond 2 degrees, and that whole global north construction of what kind of problem climate change is what I'm trying to address in the book.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, thank you for the journey, the riveting journey from how you got to the book. I think to begin with, I think a few listeners may be wondering what liberalism is. So I'd love to get an understanding of what do you mean by liberalism, or what does it generally mean by liberalism? And how does it relate to your book in terms of climate change? Why is it such an important, why does it warrant a book, essentially?
Thanks, Javier. So I think anyone you ask will have a different definition of liberalism. So in the book, I sort of quite quickly recognize this, that So for the purpose of the book, I've got to stick my flag somewhere. So this is my claim, or this is my definition of liberalism that informs the development of the book. At the core of that is the idea of the individual as kind of mistress or master of her own destiny, the individual as God, individual as overseer, and that all actions, all social organizations should be geared around the facilitation of the free association of individuals. And this was, I came into the book and I was really with the idea of bourgeois liberalism. And so I think here I'm, referring back to, say, the work of Amitav Ghosh in The Great Derangement, and really, and also like a Marxist perspective of this. So the bourgeois liberalism, break from feudalism, but it's all about the individual. It's all about the accumulation of capital at the individual basis, but it's also about ideas of order and what order means and the search for order that lies within that. And so I use definitions around bourgeois liberalism, and I really focus in on this issue of the individual and why that, and that really evolved as I did the reading for the book. And what the individual sort of emerged as really the concept of the individual. And why this is important, so the work I've been doing for a long time is around the communication of climate change in an effort to effect behaviour change. And so what lies at the core of that work is the idea that people must voluntarily come to the table and choose to lead a low carbon life. It mustn't be imposed on people. They must choose to do it. So everything must be done to facilitate an environment in which the choice that person makes is the one that supports the net zero transition, a phrase which I critique a lot in the book, and a concept I critique a lot in the book. And that to me has got, I can see that's got nowhere. I think it's and so it says like the individual. So at the core of that is this debate: is it individual change versus system change? And on where the work I've been doing, it's like, well, it's a bit of both. The individual really has an important role to play. And eventually, and ultimately what I'm trying to get, the point I'm trying to make in the book is there's no such thing as the individual. And that as a basis for action on climate change is a failure and will continue to fail. We are not individuals. We are creatures of, no man is an island, as the phrase goes. So that's really what I'm looking to unpick, and to extend that. Why write a book? What's the point of writing a book about it? What I want to do in the book is, as climate change becomes more widely discussed in our culture, becomes a more prominent feature of our culture, so more people will come into that debate and will form ideas about what should be done about climate change. What I want to do with this book is demonstrate how the language we use, the liberal language of climate change, actually encapsulates, incorporates power, certain power structures, certain ideologies. And it's so effective as an ideology because it seems like it's just natural, and it could be impossible to think about who we are and the world and what we want in any other way. And that's how ideology is so effective. So what I'm trying to do with this book is unpack how power works through the liberal language of climate change. So that when we talk about it, we can be more aware. So one of the points, again, I'm making in the book, and I take this from someone else, and I can't remember who it is, but obviously I cite it and reference it properly in the book. But what I'm playing with here is, I think, quite a radical idea, is that we are not individuals. We're simply nodes in the circulation of discourses and capital. That's all science is all anything is. And so, and the ideas of agency are a middle-class liberal fantasy. And they're not the basis for action on climate change. What's my evidence for that? Well, look around us. Nothing's happening. We've had many years of it. So yeah, that's the
Yeah.
claim.
So I mean, to summarize, if I'm understanding your book correctly in terms of the intention, it's really to bring a collective awareness to the idea that liberalism is an ideology, one, and two, the way in which we speak about climate change, but even how we conceptualize the world, how we act in the world, how that all manifests is in a way that puts the individual as the primacies of the individual. The individual is sacred. It's all about self-driven choice, and it's about if you want change to happen, you have to be the change you want to see in the world. It's about the individual as the center of the universe, right? So, I mean, this is very interesting. I mean, I don't know where the phrase is from, but there's a phrase where awareness precedes control. And I think I very much like the idea of bringing to the foreground things that were lurking in the background. So there's the famous quote from David Foster Wallace about, the story about the two fish. There's two young fish swimming in a pond. An older fish comes by and says, "Hey kids, how's the water?" And then the other two fish are like, "What's the water?" I suppose the water in this story, or in this in life right now, is liberalism. Would you agree?
For us in the West, yes. And I was almost going to use that quote in the book, and I think it dropped out in the end. So thanks for introducing that. Exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So before we get on to some of the guardrails, or perhaps some of the argumentation, I wanted to push back. So you said we are not individuals, and so essentially positing the idea that we are, as in society, if we are, or at least in the global north and the west, if we are going to help resolve climate change, we can't rely on individual decision makers. We can't rely on people like Greta Thunberg or activists of these nature to sort of snap us out of it, so to speak. If that's the case, I just thought the first challenge I would give is that throughout history, there have been multiple movements for progressive rights, whether that's civil rights, whether it's women's rights. There have been several movements that have been led by a group of people, which have formed a collective, but perhaps started at the individual level. Would you say that this is something that we can do with climate change? It can just be a matter of the case that climate science as a field of study is very new. Its inception was in the 60s, or I guess in the 1890s, but more, like you said, it came to the public awareness in the 80s and the 90s. Perhaps it's just not been that much time. And perhaps if we let time go by, although we don't have a lot of it with climate change in mind, eventually we will get our act together. What do you say to that challenge?
So obviously, I've come across this idea before, looking to other historical instances of when there has been change. How has that come about? And can we replicate that for climate change? So the claim I make in my book is that we can't, that liberalism has no answer to the crisis of climate change.
Mm.
And so many of those examples that do emerge, whether that's around sort of identity politics, whether it's around sort of civil rights, etc. The form of what Martin Luther King said that got carried forward, all the anti-capitalist stuff was stripped out, right? So all of those movements have been able to sit within the framework of liberalism and not challenge liberalism. They've been incorporated into the framework of liberalism. Liberalism is made stronger as a result, because look, it's brought about this progress. This progress has been allowed within liberalism. That's been great. I'm from a working class background. I write this book as I say, right, as a lover of liberalism, or what it could be. It's allowed me, from a working class background, to be sat here talking to you today, and it brought me as a very stimulating conversation, very interesting, stimulating career. I'm blessed. I'm one of the lucky ones. So I have a lot of love for liberalism, but as I say, it keeps, sort of kicking me in the teeth. So to come back to the point that I was trying to make, and hopefully I can get back there. So the point is that climate change cannot be resolved within liberalism, right? So to look to those other examples, I claim, is a misnomer. because actually, I mean, liberalism will triumph. No one's going to overturn liberalism. I can't see it happening, but it hasn't got the answers to climate change. The best is, at the moment, we are looking. The discourse that I examine in the book talks about solutions to climate change around net zero by 2050, about 1.5 C. I think we're at what, sort of 1.1, 1.2 degrees centigrade at the moment. And certainly when I go on Twitter, all I see is images of drought and floods and hurricanes and fires across the world. And net zero by 2050 is a strategy to continue increasing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases out to 2050 to give a 66% probability of warming not exceeding 1.5 C. That's the best deal on the table. Sat here today, I look at that and I say, well, so I can't see how societies and food systems, etc., function if we continue into the next 20 odd years to increase atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. So no one can predict the future, but I'm just, just from what the science says, etc., that seems to me a really high risk strategy. And that's what's on offer for liberalism. And to look beyond that, which is what I'm trying to do with this book. There's two types of people, apparently. We're all deniers, or we're doomers or deniers. So the one set of people who challenge net zero because they want anything, no policy on climate change. It's all, overblown and exaggerated. And then there's a few, again, on the margins, not heard, get denigrated as doomers, but I'm just trying to base it on the empirical and historical and political analysis available to me. That says that liberalism cannot do this, cannot deliver it. We're not going to make the progress. The solution on offer from liberalism for climate change, net zero by 2050, is a design. It's not what I would call a solution. I don't know what it's a solution to, and I will. I just came, and then I'll finish. What it does, how it gets legitimated by liberal commentators, is to say it allows us to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. What the worst impacts are, I don't know. I don't know if they're extinction, termination, what they are. But if in actual fact, what liberalism is offering us is the best thing to offer us is survival, mere survival, then perhaps it's time to rethink what liberalism means and whether we need a different way of being in the world.
So, and it seems like as well, if what you were saying in terms of 2050, did you say it was a 66 probability of not meeting?
67%, yeah. If we do everything laid out in the policies for 1.5 C, that will, by 2050, there'll be a 66% probability that warming will not exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's what those policies are. That's the solution. That's the ambitious action.
Right, and as you talk about in your book, from what I've read as well, is that 1.5 degrees centigrade warming is not a happy place. The current, as we see right now, with heat waves, with floods, with droughts, the current scenario at 1.1 degrees centigrade, which is what we are right now, is not great. 1.5 is going to be far worse. And so to say that 1.5 is the goal, it's almost as if liberalism is complacent with catastrophe in a sense, or perhaps it's a bit agnostic to catastrophe as long as liberalism is maintained. Would you say that's your argument essentially?
Yeah, and it's been brought down to very few words by a number of authors. I don't know, different authors get cited as the originator of this very common statement. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, liberalism, whatever. So that's what motivates me. How come when I speak to people, and I've done a lot of workshops with people, no one wants what's coming, and yet we are all shuffling mutely towards it.
It's very strange.
Is it that this is the most advanced civilization? We're reasonable, rational people. This is the epitome of human development and evolution. And this is where we're at. How could that possibly be?
Yeah, I mean, this is just a quick anecdote, but I've recently joined the workforce. So what you say, as a graduate. So I'm working in the corporate world, doing my corporate thing, which I'm agnostic about. But what I find very interesting is so a career is roughly 80,000 hours, roughly, over the span of your whole life. What I find very bizarre is that people can select careers that have the careers exist sort of independent of climate change existing. So people can work, I don't know, doing random jobs for their whole life, not contributing towards mitigating or assisting with climate change in some way, even if it's very, very marginally. And albeit there are some essential roles that you need to sort of work in to help mitigate climate change. But for all those that are working in, I guess, non-essential services, what I find very strange as someone that's doing that is, why aren't people dedicating resources towards mitigating climate change given the scenarios that we have in place? Why aren't businesses reorienting towards mitigating climate change with all that we know that is in place? And even though everyone acknowledges that it's going to happen or it is happening and that we need to be moving faster, we aren't moving faster. And I suppose that's a sort of strange, maybe guilt that we are complacent to it being in a liberal society. We just have to expect individuals to arrive at the whenever they arrive at them, even if the world is burning. So I feel I've gotten the transference of, I guess, anger, or at least that's what I'm feeling from just, like even just talking about it. But I mean, just to jump back to your previous point, it seems as though previous movements, they've succeeded not because of they've been able to succeed not because of liberalism, but in spite of it, in a way. And perhaps I'm not framing that correctly, but essentially, liberalism's blind spot is climate change, liberalism's blind spot is climate change, and it's a problem that's so big and encompasses so many stakeholders, so many players, that no amount of individual change is going to mitigate it. It requires something that's much greater.
Agreed. And I think, and to extend that point, that the idea that we are all agentic is the term, individuals with agency, is a middle class fantasy, and I could kind of go down that path probably, but it's not too.
Yeah.
And so it's just extrapolates, right? So everyone, I've got, I was brought up by, and I'll be, you can be a bit facetious. I was brought up by mummy and daddy to, think I'm an important person and I should be able to shape the world according to my wills, and what I want, I will have. And so, and then it gets extrapolated by these middle class actors who dominate the NGOs and the discourse out to everyone. Well, everyone's got agency. But I spend a lot of time. I come from working class background. My friends are working class. I don't hang around with activists. Right, that's not my world. And all there is despair, a turning back. There's worry, but that's not. Oh, and I'm going to, do something about it. It's worry. And it's a turning inwards as a result of that worry, and a doubling down on the search for short-term, immediate gratifications.
Yeah, something I feel a bit of tension in with the argument about liberalism and climate change, and perhaps having non-liberal arguments, or non-liberal solutions to climate change. Something I feel perhaps the inner cynic in me is that perhaps this is an argument that only someone left of center could make, because sounds like a right-leaning person's worst nightmare. Oh no, it's a global government where everyone comes together and it's one big, huge party. Would you? And there are arguments I've seen to this degree, sort of conspiratorial arguments. I'm not too sure if you've seen people. There's groups online that say that organizations like the World Economic Forum sort of engaged in a mass sort of coordination of trying to take away your beef. They're trying to put implants in you to track all your data with all your information with IoT devices. There's all this sort of conspiracy, but I think the underlying essence of the argument is global control, some sort of global entity controlling us is scary. What would you say to sort of a cynic who's maybe right of center, who may say that anti-liberal solutions is sort of a dog whistle for communism or some global form of communism or something like that? Perhaps that is the argument. Perhaps that is the solution. But what would you say to that sort of view?
Yes, so it's a great question. I pulled back. I was talking to someone earlier this week for a podcast, and and I kind of pulled my punches a bit towards the end of the book, so what's the alternative? Because then one starts to say, what is it? Anti-reason, anti-intellectualism? Is it communism that you are suggesting? So many of the critiques of liberalism that I draw on come from Marxist and communist thought and research. And for me, they are compelling, the arguments. Obviously, I wasn't put them in the book about the idea of the individual as being unhelpful. And then, so yeah, you have these people who say, and I know them. My mum is one of them who gets all her worldviews from Facebook and these groups. So I've encountered it, and it's a worldview, right? So as much as no one's going to shift me from my worldview, and might say, well, I've done my research and I've read these books, and so you should listen to me. I think what I would get to there, Javier, and I'm trying to make the point so that's relevant to the book, is that what we're talking about here is control. Okay, so and when you said, earlier you were saying about like what's the story of the book. So George Orwell said, well, in a famous essay, why do I write? And the first reason was vanity. I write out of that. I want to be heard. Okay. I want to be someone in the world, etc., etc. Now, so these the Great Reset and all this stuff. This comes from marginalized groups who have lost control over their lives through AI, and the discourse is you're going to lose more control over your lives. So they've been de-skilled. They have found that borders have been broken down, and their ability to negotiate, decent wage, decent way of life with the loss of unions and globalized workforce has been undermined. They see these credentialed classes who have no connection with their lives, telling them what they're going to do. There's a book, I haven't read it, but I did come across it in a review of it called Why We Drive. And so so the car is, this idea of freedom is really key to it. I think you really hit on something here, Javier, and I try and explore it in the book. I don't think I do justice to it because obviously it's complex. But in the, why we drive. So when I'm in my car, right, that's my territory. That's my, I've got my, it communicates a status about who I am. But I can drive where I want, when I want. I've got freedom of movement. I can take what risks I want on the road as long as I don't get nicked for it. And that's the risk I take. But I'm in control. The car is almost like the last place for many of these people that I have any freedom or control. And so it becomes, we're seeing this in the UK at the moment, where there's an effort to introduce low emission zones. And the car ownership has become the real battlefield. I just saw a headline today that Conservatives are really focusing on the car ownership as this. So I think for these people, I sympathise with them, right? I sympathise that this is just another example, climate policy of the middle classes, the credentialed classes, coming into their lives, telling them what they can and can't do. And I've got very little control left of my life, very little room for maneuver. And you want to come along and take that last bit away from me. Now, that's what I think is happening here. What would I say? I haven't got a compelling argument against them, so I kind of got a lot of sympathy. That's exactly what's happening. And I would say, this, and I think the net zero discourse, when you look at it, is like, your life's rubbish. You've got no control over your life, and everything's. Certainly, I'm talking about the UK here, where I think it's very much a declining country. Losing its. But look, you can get an air source heat pump. Buy an air source heat pump and everything will be great. There's this narrative of net zero. It's got nothing to offer the working classes, right? And so the right, this is the thing that people like Chris Hedges and others have said, that liberals have kind of vacated a story of progression of a good life that means something to the mass of humanity. And so what happens is the right can rush into that vacuum and populate it with these bullshit stories about, cars, etc. They can just reduce freedom down to your ability to drive your car when and where you want. And the left have got no response, really. I mean, Roland Barthes said, why is it the right have always got the best stories? And they have. And I hear a lot of lament around Brexit, take back control. That was, and that's honed in on in the UK as the slogan that won the referendum for the right. Take back control. But of course, and again, I draw a Marxist analysis here. In a capitalist society, you've got no control. Once you sign that contract for work, you're just talking about there. That's it. That's a third of your hours gone where you are not. It's not a democracy. It's not in control there. The other third you're asleep, and then the other third, well, AI's come to take what freedom you've got left. So this is why it's no point just trying to solve the problem through air source heat pumps. It's much bigger than that. And after 8 years of working on engagement and communication and seeing it go nowhere, really, it's you have to look beyond that. You've got to look at the big picture. I don't see any other way out of this.
Yeah, there's a. Oh, I need to find this quote. So essentially, how I sort of summarize what you're saying, or perhaps what I've taken away from it, is that the freedoms that. Well, okay, let me take a step back. So, in response to the question about, potential, what a cynic would say if what a response would be to a cynic who would say that this is an argument, some sort of dog whistle for communism, is to say, well, first of all, to point out something and to make an observation about the current state of affairs doesn't necessitate some sort of solution following that. So just because we're saying liberalism is the water in which we swim in, it is the way in which we conceptualize the world, doesn't necessarily mean that we're saying because of this, we ought to have this solution. So because liberalism is not solving it, we ought to have communism. The argument you're simply putting is this is the way it is, and this is how it has been. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, in terms of actual solutions, well, I suppose that's up to the people that read your book, right? And viewers that listen to the podcast that think about what are the solutions. And you've said that you mentioned some in your book, but following your response, how I sort of view it, and this talking about sort of these conspiratorial sort of arguments about people taking away freedoms, it seems as though people are given freedom for it to be in the wrong places, and for where it is meant to be in the right places, they don't have it. So, for example, like you said, right, about workers being robbed of their livelihoods because of artificial intelligence, because the coal mine is closed and they can no longer work, and then they're being appealed to by argumentation, right-leaning argumentation, such as, well, climate change is all about taking away your money. They don't want your interest, they just want to reduce emissions, but they don't care about you as an individual. In a sense, that is, it can be true, and it is true in a lot of instances, but there's an argument that I think is, I think, as you point out, and as someone on our podcast pointed out, Matt Huber, he's a Marxist geographer, which I didn't even know those two things could go together. But he points out that the Koch brothers and the right have correctly identified that the left have crap arguments with regards to how to appeal to people with climate change. It cannot be about having a carbon tax and then having the price affect the most disproportionate people in the country. You have to have arguments you have to show people why it matters, and you have to give people value. And so, I mean, he talks about, for example, unionizing certain industries like the transport industry, and then the electricity industries, so that workers that work for wind energy, solar energy, and whatnot can argue for better pay, can get better livelihoods, and then following that, emissions reduce. And that's a legitimate way of saying this is why climate change matters to you, because it helps your livelihood, it helps your family, it helps the environment, it helps everyone. And it's not as simple as just saying, well, if we have carbon tax, then everyone will want to do it because emissions are important, because obviously that's not the way to appeal to everyone. Anyway, sorry, that was a long sort of summary and sort of point, but I just thought, yeah, okay. Well, with that in mind, I think getting on track, I think this could be an interesting place to talk about maybe some non-liberal responses to climate change. Do you have any at the top of your mind that you think are legitimate points that you think we can start at? Yeah,
I do. I mean, I think I see a lot of great ideas out there. I'm always loath to kind of try and step into this space because they if they don't come with a strategy for wresting power from entrenched actors and power structures, then they're not going to get anywhere. So I can I just preface this and see if this comes in with it, and then I'll come back to the question of what I quote in my book an African proverb, when the music changes, so does the dance, right? So ultimately, I think people generally would just do what they're told, right? And just, we're born into the world. So people just get on with it. Once they'll say, well, this change is coming, and the media will, if it's not aligned with the interests of profit making, the media and a few people kick off, and people soon get used to it and crack on. And so within on those I'm very influenced by the Russian Revolution, okay, and how that came about and what that was about. And not saying it's necessarily a highly environmentally sensitive transition. It doesn't mean that it always has to be that destructive of the world. So I'm going to come to some solutions, but I think what the core of it, and I think this is one of the challenges of liberalism, is like, what do we think of people? Do we fear people, or do we love people? Do we have faith in the people? And I think liberalism talks about the individual, etc., but actually I don't think it's got any faith in the people. And I would, and I'll give an example. I'm going to lump in a few points here on my journey to the point I want to make. We hear a lot about the just transition and other climate justice, etc. But the just transition within the global north, right? It must be fair. It must be fair. But I didn't hear anything about that to the Gilets Jaunes protests in Paris when the working class kicked off in an uncontrolled way. And I went shortly afterwards to a kind of a think tank thing in Brussels with influential people from the world of global really powerful neoliberal and liberal think tanks in the heart of Brussels. And it was apparent that was, I think I quote it in my book from the kind of the flyer I had for it. There's only about 15 of us invited. I didn't get invited back. But, it was, they just shit themselves over that, the work, because some of that argument was about, yeah, we're up for this, but it's got to be a socialist. You can't just lump a load of costs onto us. So, you see this, the effort of liberalism to incorporate that within this discussion of just transition, fair transition, not a term I hear the working class ever use, by the way. So one has to think, well, what, what do we think people are? They good? Have they got the capability to be part of a different world, or do they have to be told what to do? Can they be actors in this, etc.? And I will say this point, and then I will move on to, so what should we do? Last weekend, I went with my next door neighbour. We went to a football match, the local team, who are in the Premiership, doing very well. And my sons are both into their football. They support a different team. They're 24 and 22. And through them and through that experience, I encounter a lot of passion amongst the working class, a lot of energy, a lot of intelligence, all directed towards something utterly meaningless, like a football result. So you have all these podcasts, you have all these radio phone-ins, you have all these conversations on the train back from the football. He did that, he should do this. They should, real engagement, real passion, real energy, but directed towards something pointless. So I think, like Lenin has said this, the liberal sort of the bourgeoisie fall back from the fear. They fear the energy and intelligence of the working classes, of the masses. So for all their talk of agency and individualism and the love of people, as we see this with the wars and everything else, ultimately they don't care, and they just want, it's just another form of control and power. And we know, and we can see this. I just recently in France, isn't it? Macron in Nigeria, and just saying, well, you're not having no independence. It's still there. Still, it's all strong as ever. So, what are we going to do? What should we do about it? So, with all that in mind, I think I think the global construction of climate change, and I think you make the point, it has, or as you quote Isaac saying, it has to be global. Well, it is global at the moment. Liberalism is a global creed. And there is a global universal dangerous limit for climate change, apparently, one limit for everyone, one experience of climate change for everyone. So we have that. We've got global climate governance at the moment. It doesn't work for ordinary people. It doesn't work in terms of reducing emissions. So I'm going to make the claim for the nation state, national identity under kind of a strong centralized climate state that prioritizes whatever it means to build, to respond to climate change in a way that builds a truly sustainable and fair and equal future for all. And that means, socialism in some form. That means some kind of critical analysis of the role of technology in our lives, because at the moment that's a sacred, that technology will save us. And to try and challenge that is to bring down a whole heap of opprobrium on yourself. And it is to then put in place the structures that give people control over their lives, like the old Soviets. I'm not, again, I know it's all loaded with negative connotations, etc. But I believe in the people, but I believe the structures need to be there to withdraw from this sort of globalized, highly technical, highly kind of integrated global system where I'm reliant on my food from all parts of the world. And I've got no way. If everything broke down, I've got no way of surviving. I don't know how anything works around me. I don't know how to grow my food. I don't know how to get water. I'm stuffed. We all are, really. So I'm saying, yeah, in a way, and uncomfortable as it is, to withdraw back from the dream of technological progress and et cetera, the last 50 years, and think of a different way of living. And I know that there's risks and dangers with that, but at least it might give us some time to work out a longer term way of living in the world, because at the moment, I don't think we've even got till 2050.
Yeah. The quote that Zizek says is that disaster communism is an antidote to disaster capitalism. The state must assume a much more active role. It is through our effort to save humanity from self-destruction that we are creating a new humanity. It is only through this mortal threat that we can envision a unified humanity. And in reference to unified, one of the only times I felt truly unified this year, perhaps even in 2 years. I mean, it sounds a bit so wild to say that, but I was watching the Women's World Cup recently, and Australia was doing very, very well. The Matildas, the team, and the team ended up getting through to the semi-final, and on the night, everyone went to the pub. People that never go to the pub went to the pub. People that always go to the pub brought 10 extra friends. And the atmosphere inside the pubs, inside the stadiums, was unlike anything I've ever felt before. Because like any national sort of attendance, if you've ever gone to a sporting event that's like a World Cup, it is just everyone is on board. Everyone wants the team to win. And the feeling of knowing that a goal could happen, or feeling as if it will happen, or even if you're lucky enough to experience a goal happening, is one of the most electrifying feelings, because it is shared amongst everyone. And to your point, perhaps it is channeled into something that may be quote unquote not useful. But I think it is a perfect example of what could be. It seems like sport is delegated. Sport is not seen as something that that people of power or people with interest need to protect us against, because it makes them money, right? If sport and celebrating a goal was to have a huge, I guess, net negative for those in power, I don't think it is something we would have in a unified experience, something to experience, right? So I suppose that what I'm wondering is, this is a rhetorical question, but how can we get to the point where we feel as though we are about to score a goal, but the metaphor being we can mitigate climate change in such a way that it elicits that that sense of, you know, that sense of, I guess, I don't know, euphoria, but it's a bit, it's not exactly one for one. Fair enough. But yeah. Anyways, it's just a tangential sort of thing. But coming back to the freedom, I thought I found the Kierkegaard quote. So he says, "People demand freedom of speech as compensation for freedom of thought, which they seldom use," which I thought was a great
Yeah,
sort
yeah.
of a great encapsulation of that. But I wanted to touch on an additional sort of pushback that I'm feeling. So we sort of discussed a solution or the idea of liberalism, why it's important, how it can, why it potentially is the reason for inaction, or it is the primary reason for inaction. We've discussed the potential solution of climate state, as you've said, which how I'm understanding you is it's a one unified body where I guess other nations are all participating to say this is what we want. We want a clean climate. We want clean environment. We want to protect biodiversity, etc. This is something we'll all agree on. And we've pushed back a bit. But in terms of another pushback, so if liberalism is such a fundamental value of Western society, if it is something that if it is the water in which we swim in and we don't even realize it is there, is it realistic? Oh, I don't even know. I don't really like the word realistic, but do you see it as a plausible solution to say we need to remove it, or we need to not have it in this particular context? Or is that even not the right question? Can we replace the value, or can we exchange it? Is that possible?
So one of the points I make in the book is a great pushback, and one of the points I make in the book is that, and I sort of mentioned it earlier, you know, my love of liberalism and the gratitude for, you know, that freedom of thought that comes with it. Wonderful. It comes with downsides. You know, what am I going to do today? Who am I going to be today? But liberalism had the promise of kind of open examination of what we might do and how we might live. And a break with tradition. We just do this because previous generations did it, and that's why we do it. We investigate through science. We improve our understanding of the world, and we can manipulate the world to better extract resources, etc., but also to improve healthcare and, you know, a number of other benefits. And, you know, and over the last 20, 30 years, liberalism has what has it done? It's freed women from the oppression by men. It's, you know, freed people to live their identity without fear of attack or marginalization. So, you know, it's done many wonderful things that no one would ever want to lose those things. But so what I think is happening is that so that's what liberalism in theory, the Enlightenment, etc., has always done. It's been in tension with conservative ideals, small c conservative ideals, progress and conservation, always. Industrialization and romanticism. There's always been that tension, that dialectic, and that's been productive at times. And here is another driver of change, climate change, a driver. I'm proposing a driver of historical change. Again, liberalism as its ideal, stepping up to the plate. How should we live in the face of this? And that would include, I think, truly, liberalism looking at itself. And you know, it kind of it becomes a bit messy and difficult then, saying, well, what are the elements of where liberalism has taken us that we want to keep? What do we abandon? How do we manage those tensions moving forward? And I think and this is what I'm getting at. Actually, liberalism has found itself, it's become quite sclerotic, and it's become unable then to fulfill its potential in the face of climate change, because it's saying, well, whatever it is we do, these are the things we're not going to examine. These are the things that are not up for debate. But these are the very things we should be examining. So this is what I'm, so this is what I'm on about, really, like the limits of liberalism in the face of climate limits, and
mm.
we're at this impasse. So I don't, I'm not sat here working. Why would I speak for 8 billion people? But liberalism should say, right, okay, re-examination of everything because we're reaching this impasse. What comes next?
Yeah, I feel from based on what you're saying, it's sort of I think it's a psychoanalytic idea. I don't really know, but the idea that certain, okay, so I'll use a personal example just to make it more clear and less abstract. So when I was younger, I wasn't the brightest sort of kid. I had fun, did random things, didn't pay much attention in school. But eventually this led to me sort of developing some sort of neuroses about not being good enough, not being smart enough, etc. Anyways, you get the idea.
Yeah, being there, yeah.
Yeah. And because of this neuroses, I had learned ways to adapt. So I became someone that was highly ambitious, someone that strove to do the best in everything that they did. And it worked in some ways because I ended up doing really well in school, got into a good university, got a good job. Anyways, but the mechanism of trying to avoid the feeling, the neuroses or whatever, was useful to a point, and then it stops becoming useful. It starts becoming something that actually holds you back. It starts becoming something that essentially is causing you more harm than good. And even though it did it in some ways saved you, or at least alleviated a lot of hardship at the time, it no longer does so, and it is causing the inverse effect now. So like using the example, liberalism has brought us many good things. It has allowed us to it allows us to bring rights, give rights to people, civil rights, the rights to women, the rights to indigenous peoples, the protection of rights for certain individuals and whatnot. And it's been very, very good. And it's without it, we probably we know, because in certain societies where liberalism is not a key value, there are certain things we can say, well, this is the value liberalism brings. And now we've met a new challenge that we have to rise to, which is climate change, which we are not equipped to deal with. And so the solution is to, like you said, liberalism has reached the time to examine itself. There's a really good John Steinbeck quote, which reminded me, where he's looking at a horizon in this book. The book's called Cannery Row. And he looks at the horizon, the character says, "It is the hour of the pearl. It is the interval between day and night where time stops to examine itself." Now, this is so beautiful. I've memorized, but the idea of examining oneself is something that I think is a very useful metaphor to say, or personifying liberalism. And so perhaps I'll just finish off on one last quick story as well. I've been trying to read, not really successfully, but a book called The Existentialist Cafe, and it's about Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. It's sort of like a semi-autobiographical sort of book. But the author talks about how these two philosophers, they arrived at the time in which World War II was occurring, where they felt as though there wasn't any freedom to be oneself. There was a war, and then after the war, there was chaos, there was disaster, and their sort of philosophy allowed them to embody a life of freedom. It was their circumstance and their philosophy was a response to the environment around them. And so I suppose this is an invitation to listeners, and also it's a response to listeners to say, well, this is the perfect fertile ground for new philosophies, for new ideas, for new solutions to come about, and they don't have to be within the frame of liberalism. I suppose that's how I would put it. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
That would be a very liberal response to our problem, yeah. And it would be great,
yes, okay.
So it doesn't have to include liberalism, exactly. But of course, that just doesn't, it's just not really an easy. Very few people are ready for that. I think I've just started through the book, starting to make some connections with people. Perhaps, some glimmer of light is starting to emerge there. A willingness to start that difficult self-examination is a great analogy you make, spot on. Yeah, about and I think that I can't think of the quote now as a quote in the book, but an ideology, by the time it becomes entrenched, has already outlived its usefulness, and the task then, and this is from a historian, White, White, who the most urgent task is to deconstruct that ideology, name it, change, expose it, deconstruct it. Yeah, in a way, not so, but name it, know it for what it is, because that's the thing. This is it. Is it ideology is the water in which we swim in, right? So it is successful because it doesn't even appear as ideology. So net zero is not ideology. Any critique of net zero is ideological. That's how it gets presented. That's what one finds in the discourse. And of course, net zero is an idea about how we might live. It's ideology.
Well, that being said, I think we've arrived at a very good point to sort of start closing off. And I'm curious to see if you had any final points or any final thoughts you'd like to leave listeners with, whether that be new ideas from your book or a continuation or a summation of what we've just discussed.
Thanks, Javier. Well, I will take that invitation. I think the most important ethical imperative, the primary ethical imperative at the moment, and this is where I'm looking to move forward to next with my work, is to take the idea that societies cannot organize effectively to live with the risks and impacts of climate change without at least, to some level, a shared understanding of what those impacts and risks are. I feel the liberal discourse of climate change has failed to do that. And I see that expressed most clearly in the imagery of our net zero future, which I see corporations use. They'll have imagery about life in 2050. Governments have it. Research institutions have it. And it's a world pretty much like now. It's liberalism minus the emissions, and we're all going to be like that wherever you are in the world. This is the vision for us all. Whether whatever continent you live in, whatever your culture, and climate change impacts have disappeared from this 2050. There is no climate change, and you look at it, I can share them with you. So the work I'm doing at the moment of moving into is a research agenda to build a new visual vocabulary of our 2050 future, which is scientifically more accurate, because the current representations are almost a form of science denial, as strong as you'll see anywhere. So scientifically accurate, are based on what people want from their 2050 future, and what is actually possible within where we are and what impacts we're going to have to live with. So it's building a new, more inclusive, more diverse, and more realistic set of images of our 2050 future to build a shared understanding of the risks we face. And that feels to me an important starting point for delivering better outcomes for us all. And why imagery? And this is my final point, and I'll go back in time to pre-liberal times. Back in the medieval ages, churches in, say, UK, you have stained glass windows, you have pictures all along the walls. People were not literate, and people are not literate about climate change, right? And people were not literate full stop in those days. And so how did you tell the story of the kingdom of God? How did you tell people how to live? It was through imagery. And so you have this very image-laden sort of architecture and discourse of Christianity in the UK. And that's what we need again now. It's not about talking about emissions, about parts per million, about 2050, about 1.5 C. It's a build of visual vocabulary of what is possible, what is available to us, and through that to build that shared understanding of the risks we face, which doesn't exist at the moment. Where that leads to, I'm not saying it's a solution to everything, but that feels to me the gap in where we need to move to next. So that's for me where the next step, where I want to leap on from the book, the next steps on from what the arguments laid out in the book.
Absolutely. And I suppose just to tag on to that line of thinking, I would say also stories are a very powerful tool of communication. When climate deniers or even people that believe in climate change have not really looked at any evidence, when they're determining whether their belief, when determining their belief in something, a huge factor, at least at what I've seen in my personal life, is someone's told them about something and it's someone that they trust, and the story in which they've told is very compelling, and they feel, well, I mean, this person just told a great story. How can I not believe them? So it's that visual sort of uh, the visuals along with the storytelling, which you could say create the mental visuals, in a way I think are very powerful. And I suppose one example of a society in which they were able to do that, perhaps I would say the most successful society, is the Indigenous Australian Society, which has the longest continuing people on the entire planet, as I understand, about 50 to 60,000 years. And a really provocative idea I've come across within Indigenous thinking in Australia is the idea of the use of artwork. So listeners may be very familiar with Indigenous artwork. It looks like dot paintings to craft a much bigger painting. What the first thing is quite interesting to note is a lot of the Indigenous paintings are from a bird's eye point of view. So it gives you a very different idea of what things are, as opposed to looking at them as if you're looking at them straight on. But the second thing is that our conception of what they're doing as art is an incredibly Western lens. And so the idea that art is a commodity, one, is a very Western idea, but two, how the Indigenous people view what they're doing, it is not conceived as art. It is conceived as story. It is conceived of finding meaning in their surroundings and their world, if I understand correctly, which I'm not 100% right, but in essence, it's about storytelling. It's about communication. And so I think those two sort of ideas in terms of the most successful in terms of lifespan, longevity, people's using visuals, storytelling to pass on stories for millennia, I think is a good example of what you're talking about. But I think that's a good place to wrap up.
Thank you, Javier. I've enjoyed this conversation immensely. Thank you so much for the chance to appear on your podcast.